Hi, I'm Amanda Graham, and today in our final session of Feedback Arts Economies, we discussed the relationship between the local arts economy and the national arts economy. In particular, we were interested in the way that politicians and organizations represent arts and arts labor rhetorically. We investigated that through conversation with our participants, many of whom have deep expertise in the arts themselves. I wanted to start us off with not one of the readings, but this. I'm going to put it in the chat. This is not a hard thing to find online. You'll see when I put it there. So there is Joe Biden's website. And I'm not sure if, how many of you actually have looked at this website. Maybe you have, maybe you're very familiar with this website. What I was, and if you haven't looked at it, please take a look at it now. And I think they ask you for money right away. Just, don't ignore that. Moving on. I, took a look at this website after the election because I was curious about Joe Biden's art platform, the platform on the arts. And that's what that other hyperallergic article was all about, was Joe Biden's policy on the arts and background in the arts, and Harris's background in the arts as well. And of course, a lot of this is about jobs, right? That on this website, no surprise, if you scroll down, you'll see that that Joe Biden is committed to manufacturing and innovation, infrastructure and clean energy, investing in caregiving and the education workforce. And that's all great. I mean, that's certainly a nice presentation of some important ideas. But I'm just going to state the obvious, right? That the arts are not included in those platforms. And that doesn't mean that they're not a part of Biden's policy. But one thing that strikes me that often happens, and I don't think that it's unique to Biden's website, but I just use that as an example because, he's on our minds right now and he's incoming, is that when we talk about labor and we talk about job creation, oftentimes rhetorically, whether it's a politician talking about it or it's in the news, that we aren't talking about the arts. And that's maybe not a surprise to anybody that's in this room, but I thought it might be useful as we close out this course to think about why that is. And so I just wanted to kind of reflect on that for a minute. Why when Joe Biden with other politicians are talking about job creation or they talk about labor, that it's disassociated from the arts? Why do you think that is?
I think because it's still considered a luxury by so many people. Even though it's part of our society and every culture across the globe, it still has that stigma of being a luxury item, oftentimes for white people.
So it's racialized and it has a stigma associated with it because it's sort of a luxury item. So it's not a necessity, perhaps.
Right, and it's elitist, it's exclusive. It's considered somehow divorced from labor, from work, which is interesting when you think about the fact that it's so deeply embedded in all of our lives, right? That, it's hard to extract the one from the other. And we know from the very first class, the kinds of dollars that it generates for every local economy. We know too that when artists move into an area, it tends to transform the region. often, gentrifying it so that other artists can't then move in, but that's a whole nother conversation. I think that, I'm an art historian by training, so I have been on the receiving end of a lot of jokes. And, it's fascinating to me because over the years, there was a study done probably 20 years ago now at Rutgers about this, where they actually took apart all the humanities majors and sort of studied the requirements for each one. And across the board, what they found through all these universities across the country, that art history was the hardest major by far, that the demands were extraordinary because you're having to memorize all kinds of different simultaneous things, visual and otherwise, and that's, tends to be quite difficult for undergraduates, especially if they've had no prior training in it. So, but that argument gets completely lost. They're now training doctors and other kinds of, high, difficult sorts of jobs that require a high level of precision in art history so that they become better at noticing detail. Because but that doesn't get discussed either. It's not, somehow that's just an add-on. It doesn't, so anyway, yeah, sorry, I've dominated too much of your time, but yes, I think
no, Libby,
it's very rich, this conversation. It's, it's a problem, I think.
Yeah, and I think that, that brings us to President Obama's comments that, were in that article that were about art history and being sort of dismissive about it. And I remember, in my Facebook feed, a lot of art historians noted it and were angry about it. But at the same time, this is something I talked about Lauren, to Lauren earlier about, that because we're so used to in the humanities oftentimes being belittled, that it's okay to laugh at ourselves and say, oh, ha, 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 like that well, we can take a joke, and we'll even repost this as a joke about ourselves.
Well, I mean, look on the car guys, right? That was their joke of choice, and studied art history down the road at Harvard.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about and I see that Katie's also posted some things. Celia, go ahead. Yeah.
It invokes for me some of, I wrote about the Federal Theater Project and the WPA Arts Projects. And they, of course, were created as a jobs program. That was the argument that the Roosevelt administration used to push it through, is that you wanted to give people jobs in the thing they knew how to do, because you were helping them to keep their skills up and blah, 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 blah. But one of the arguments against, especially in reading the Federal Theater Project, came from professional artists who argued that the market would reward talent, and that by putting out of work people back to work in the arts, you were thwarting that. And those people, if they were talented enough, they would have jobs and they would be getting that money. And I think that speaks a bit to the sort of elitism about it even now, but also that sort of market force capitalist argument that good art will make its way because it will be rewarded, right, with audiences and money. I think that's a false argument, by the way. I don't actually agree with that argument, but it's interesting how sort of perennial that argument is even now.
And that's interesting, because I know I've been part of some conversations where folks are talking about, how do we come up with something WPA style to help all of the artists who are currently, basically out of work because they can't do the usual concerts or theatrical productions or vending at the festivals that they usually do. And I think we saw that too in how complicated it was for folks, independent contractors, to navigate the pandemic unemployment assistance, because it was just so not understood by the people writing that policy. So you had people who had 1099 income and W-2 income trying to navigate all of that, or, they were only 1099, but for those folks who either were doing programs just on handshakes and not on contracts. So they didn't have any way to prove what income they had lost. And then even further out, and Katie, maybe you saw this with the artist relief work that you were doing too, but where artists were being asked in some places to justify, like, well, how much money have you lost? It's like, they don't even know, because you can't really calculate those performances that you didn't get booked for, because everybody said, well, we're not going to book it and then cancel it. So we're just, shuttering. And how that impacted, we don't know what we would have sold at this festival, or we don't know where we might have gotten a booking from, because everything just dried up. And how to navigate and address that for people who literally do make their incomes and their livelihoods off of creative work, off of performing, off of creating, and where is their income coming from at this point?
Another thing I was thinking of too, have any of y'all listened to the Art Curious podcast? It's so great. And it's Jennifer Dassel, who is a curator at NCMA. Mm-hmm. And one whole season is about the role of artists in World War II, which I thought was just fascinating. And, how artists were hired to go essentially, paint in plein air on the battlefield. They were hired to create, sculptural replicas of battle scenes to, thwart the opposing forces or whatever. And I don't know, just listening to all this just made me think, can you imagine if in today's military, artists were actually hired for whatever need it may be? It just, why then, when I feel like society was even more conservative and more pragmatic, why then were artists considered an essential piece of the puzzle, and now they're not? I just, what changed?
I think something that changed is possibly to do with the politicization of society. And what really jumped out at me in that article about President Obama's comment was not his comment, which I find it easy to explain away by just being a sort of off the cuff remark, though not one that doesn't have some significance attached to it, obviously, but was the Republican quotes from Republican politicians, which said something similar but much more pernicious. And it's hard, I can't avoid the conclusion that part of it is a fear of art, the power of art, the reflection of the power of art. Since Jesse Helms and Mapplethorpe and all of that, art has been politicized. It's been degraded by generally one side of the political spectrum. And so I don't know if that was the case back when these wonderful programs were happening. I imagine it was to some extent.
It was, very much so. And it's what ended a lot of the programs. Only a few of them carried on into World War II. But that was other objections that came from conservatives in Congress, were that it would be a place that would harbor communists and socialists, which it kind of did. But it also, but it would be a propaganda machine for the president and that there would be no way to counter that. And so that it was political then, and there was just that moment because of the really dire situation the country was in, and because the Roosevelt administration had enough votes and enough power to push some things through. But those are very, those conservatives that you're talking about, Jonathan, never forgot that. And they came back again in the 60s with the same arguments and carried it on. So it's definitely political.
And it continues on with the attacks on the National Endowment for the Arts to this day.
They've almost gutted that now at this point, ever since the days of Jesse Helms, that was the real, so.
I was going to offer that a lot of the artists that I talk to most frequently are musicians and DJs. And what seems to be getting in their way is technology. And I would imagine that for other sectors of the arts, it's similar. And of course, technology is always the gift and the curse for all of us. We're on this Zoom right now. As much as we hate it, we depend on it. But I'm thinking in terms of, for example, with DJs, we have all this ability to automatically curate our music. So do we feel like DJs are as important, or do we feel like we can substitute something that's in our pocket and seemingly easily controlled and afforded by us for, say, you know, an expensive or difficult adventure out to see someone perform live? And I think that there's so much of our lives, especially via social media, that are easily curated and easily controlled and convenient. And those 3 C's are things that we risk, you know, valuing more than originality and connection.
You know, we think of the arts, you know, we started out by saying that part of the reason that the arts maybe isn't associated with labor is because of, you know, we think of it as a luxury or elitist or exclusive. And first of all, I certainly don't think of DJing as elitist or exclusive, maybe in certain clubs, but, you know, that's not always when we're talking about the arts, right? We're talking about all different kinds of arts too. And oftentimes we don't recognize that when we say the arts, but that a lot of arts workers, we know this, both arts workers who are artists and then also arts administrators, are not wealthy people, right? That artists especially, I mean, we're talking about the Artist Relief Fund. Many artists are working class or poor. And so when we're thinking about the arts, when people have this impression that the arts are associated with elitism, but the people that are making the arts happen are not, you know, maybe there's a cultural cachet associated with being affiliated with the arts, but there's not necessarily money there. So then, but yet this elitism, you know, sometimes maybe it's a myth and sometimes it isn't, persists. And so that's kind of, you know, interesting to me that we don't associate arts with labor because of elitism, but yet artists themselves and many arts workers don't have money.
So that's true. I'm trying to think how to put in words my thoughts. It's still in the minds of some people is like a leisurely thing, you know, and like, well, if you're a poor artist, well, that's because you've chosen this leisurely profession, you know. It's not viewed as like, you know, your life's calling to be a doctor or attorney or whatever it may be. It's still just, you know, this pastime that you have chosen to pursue. And I think especially, and I mean, this is my observation as a white woman, but it seems especially that way in communities of color where like there's artists everywhere. But oftentimes if you asked who are your artists in this community, it's like they don't even necessarily identify themselves as artists. It's just what they do. I had this conversation with my colleagues at Music Maker Relief Foundation. You know, they work with primarily Black roots and blues musicians. And we were trying to, you know, we opened up these art spaces at the Eno Mill, and we want it to be diverse. We don't want it to just be all white people. And I was talking to them about their network, and they were like, that's, you know, the funny thing is that oftentimes these folks like don't even label themselves as artists. It's just what they do. From my perspective, you know, I used to run an arts center and an arts council in Northeast North Carolina, which is one of not just the most impoverished parts of our state, but the country. And there it's politicized, but it's also a matter of resources. And, you know, there just literally is not enough resources to go around to just help, you know, community residents as is. So when I come in asking for money for something that is viewed by a lot of people as frivolous, it just always fell flat. I mean, which is part of the reason why when I got this job and moved to the Triangle, I was like, oh my God, I'm finally moving somewhere where, you know, it's a priority and it's a big deal. And in some ways it is. If it wasn't, I would not be a county employee running an arts commission. But then, I don't know, a lot of times it just seems to be something that people want to say is a priority, but when it comes to actually doing the work and taking the time to learn how to do it in a equitable way, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it's as big of a priority as, and especially in Orange County. I think Orange County is so focused on social justice and human services and affordable housing, and like all those things are so critical. But in my mind, it's an and, you know, you can pair arts with every single one of those issues and come to, you know, create some really interesting solutions. But in most people's minds, it's an or. And when it's an or, when it's like feed hungry kids or fund the arts, kids are going to win, you know? So I don't know. That's just my observations.
Yeah, it seems like oftentimes arts is thought about something that is discrete when in fact it's very intersectional. I mean, many fields are intersectional, right? Like to kind of like put boundaries on a field is a little bit false. When you think about the fact that architecture might be considered an art, but then it's not part of the housing conversation to talk about art, it seems counterintuitive, right? Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's a lot of different ways this conversation could go, but one of the things that Lauren and I wanted to do this last class is to also ground, as Katie did in her first presentation, you know, us thinking about where the arts stand from a national perspective as is related to locality through the lens of COVID. And that's why Lauren suggested the one article that focused on COVID and did mention, you know, Cecilia's area of expertise here. You know, everybody, as Jamie said, everybody's talking about how do we think about arts as, you know, artists as workers again, and this, you know, this is being held up as a possible way of thinking through the contemporary moment. So Lauren, if you wouldn't mind just kind of pivoting towards that article and walking us through it a little bit.
Great. I thought this article was just very interesting. I mean, firstly, because we can't, of course, talk about the creative economy right now without talking about the impact that COVID has had. But I was also really interested in its recommendation, the fact that, the Brookings Institute is recommending essentially a substantial and sustained national recovery strategy that is grassroots and has to do with public and private partnerships. And I thought it was also interesting that they were recommending not only financial support and infrastructure, but technical support and trainings about how to deal with the health and safety requirements and how arts organizations might adapt business models to accommodate restrictions on live performances, or even rethink like how performances are presented. So, you know, sort of in light of all the sessions that we've had so far where we've spoken about, you know, the local impact of arts economies that Katie took us through, and we thought about the political implications of protests and liveness in the streets as affecting certain kinds of political economies. And, with Culture Mill and Paper Hand Puppet and Fall River Ballroom and our conversation around in that session, we thought about social economy and community, and also about the ways that artists are growing and sort of negotiating their own careers and production within a landscape that's quite complicated of kind of grant funding and different kinds of tax structures. I guess I'm curious to hear from everyone about sort of what you think is needed in this moment in particular. I mean, I know we've talked about like a kind of works progress administration kind of structure, but I feel like we have so much expertise in the room in different areas. I guess I'm curious to know whether there are specific initiatives or actions that you see as being like the most necessary to sort of start recovery.
I mean, money is the obvious answer, but what's interesting in North Carolina, when you talk about arts funding on a state level, is it's actually very bipartisan. We have a arts caucus that is almost half represented by each party. It apparently is one of the few things that our state legislators can agree on. We got this $9.4 million by our state that is, funded our local communities through the State Arts Council. I just wish that could apply to the rest of the country, that it would be less of a partisan issue and viewed more as just a fundamental part of our society. And my hope is that maybe, since we've gone so long without it, that it'll make, you don't appreciate things till they're gone sometimes, and maybe it'll help prioritize the need for arts. I don't know.
So I just will say that one of the things that we have observed at the museum, and it appears to be across the board at other institutions like ours in the country, is that people are responding overwhelmingly to the loss of not being able to be inside. And, the attendance in the art park has, tripled. Since, and of course it's because the park stayed open when other state parks were closed during the worst of the lockdown. But then again, the kind of feedback that we're hearing from people who are visiting is how valuable it is to them. And that is across the board, all demographics, all age groups, and especially even though, in art museums, we skew much older, much whiter, that what we're hearing those from groups we don't typically reach is how much it had meant to them too, and how much they miss it. And I think that is incredibly encouraging in some ways for me, for another generation. And I will just say, one of the things that we've wrestled with over the years is how to reach this population. And one of the things that we talked about a lot is the collaboration of the audience. That this seems to be a real key, not just for younger people, but also in transforming the view of a museum as a, culturally elitist, really exclusive institution into something that's far more vibrant. And I have to say, I'm so appreciative of this course, all of you who work for CPA, because the people you had on board did nothing, really underlined that for me, because they were all doing this, right? They break the fourth wall in theater, they are doing performance in the streets, they are reaching into communities, and they are getting the audience involved in a really, really important way. And I have to believe that the more that happens, the more it will dawn on others that how extraordinarily important this is in our lives. So, and I'm very hopeful that the funding will follow. That was a long-winded way of just trying to answer that question, but.
I think that also really, as you're describing the collaboration of the audience, that there's a certain kind of engagement that the artists are doing with audiences that feels like it's in fact like demonstrating in real time, like how the arts are literally like embedded in the community, so that it's not something that is separate, that's like locked away in a museum or on a proscenium stage, that it's actually that this is a moment where it's literally in the streets and outdoors in our public spaces. So that feels important too, that kind of that to kind of bridge into like a kind of seeing to believe what the value is.
Do you guys, any of you follow Hank Willis Thomas's project, the Four Freedoms project, that then spun off into the Wide Awakes, where there were artists that were, it's based on a historical actually phenomenon during during the Civil War. There were a group of advocates that were abolitionists, and they called themselves the Wide Awakes, and they would parade and demonstrate for abolition wearing capes. And Hank Willis Thomas, who's a visual artist and an activist, and the Four Freedoms Project, if you haven't seen that, it's based on Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms, the number 4. Hank Willis Thomas spells it FOR, freedoms. And there were a series of billboards across the country that he did last year and the year before. Anyway, the Wide Awakes project is in the streets. It's involving human beings. Like, you were encouraged to go get your cape. We're all artists and we're all, anyway, and that was leading up to the election. So, but yeah, I absolutely, Lauren, I completely agree.
I was just going to pick up on that word value, because that's the word that keeps coming into my mind throughout this discussion, especially in the COVID situation and with so much of the arts sector, or the creative sector, what do you want to call it, being under threat. I mean, there was a headline today that a third or a half or something like that of museums and galleries are potentially at risk. And, I would like to think that, and I think it's indisputable, that if half of our museums disappeared, many people would be very alarmed by that. But hopefully that's not going to happen. At any rate, the point is, and moments like this is when we find out what we value. And to me, that's been the nature of the COVID crisis all along. It's asking us to think about collectively and individually, what do we value? And I would like to think, and I don't think it's a wholly idealized notion, that we could come to some agreement that art and culture are valuable in and of themselves, regardless of these easily made, but also, all these arguments for the economic value of art. There's so many different flavors on that and debates to be had around it, but there's a fundamental truth underneath all of that. And it would be nice if perhaps the scare of some of the losses with the COVID situation kind of illuminated that fundamental truth, that art is valuable and that civilization requires it. Civilization, I realize, is also a word with many connotations, but the phrase, the thought I was attaching that to was that without art, it just seems to me that this is where civilizations go to die, if their arts shrivel up and are not valued and supported.
It's also what's left behind. That's how we study history, is through culture.
Exactly. It's what endures.